In 1834, while aboard the HMS Beagle as a naturalist, Charles Darwin explored an archipelago in the southern region of Chile, known as Chiloé. During this time, he wrote, "In the winter, the climate is detestable, and in the summer, it is only slightly better." He often noted the impenetrable forests and their gloomy dampness. He described the people of Chiloé as a humble, quiet, and industrious set of men, and although with plenty of food to eat, the people are very poor. Darwin was only 20 years of age during his time in Chiloé. Likewise, in 2014, at the age of 20, I traveled to Chiloé with 4 other students through a study abroad program led by Dr. Anton Daughters. Not surprisingly, the passing of 180 years has brought great change to the islands of Chiloé.
This is a place that was extremely rural throughout all of its history, up until about a generation or two ago. There weren't strong trade networks. It was a very localized economy. People who lived there were fairly self-sufficient. Starting in the late 1970s, you started to get these changes in economic policy in Santiago by the Chile's national government, in which the economy was essentially opened up to a lot of outside foreign companies whose aim was to extract natural resources in Chile. And this really altered the economy of the region. So people have been undergoing this basic shift from a rural agrarian economy to an economy that's based on wage labor. So it's essentially been a process of industrialization. People moving away from family homes, going to some of the larger urban centers in Chiloé, and rather than getting most of their food and basic necessities through fishing, through farming, through exchanges with neighbors, having to rely on cash. Communities have become very globalized in a lot of ways, and their economies have come to resemble much more closely the kind of economy that we have in the U.S.
Throughout the island, you can see the effects of modernization.
There was a lot of commerce. They had a mall, like grocery stores. They have clothing shops.
They have cars and bus systems. There's marketplaces, bakeries, restaurants, and they all depend on this cash economy.
A lot of people there have wireless internet connections in their homes. Some of them have satellite TV. It's really become pretty industrialized, fairly modern. In the end, what it really meant was a disruption of a lot of basic social relationships between people. These networks of mutual dependence that you had had for many generations all throughout the archipelago, and in particular in rural communities, started to really fall apart. Up until the 1970s and 80s was an economy that was based primarily on reciprocal arrangements between neighbors. Rather than people paying cash to friends and neighbors to help them out with different kinds of jobs and tasks, or farming, for example, people would just get help from their neighbors, and then they would return that help in kind.
Imagine trying to plant a whole potato field and only having 2 people. It would be much easier if 8 people came and did it one day, and then a couple days later you went over to the other person's farm and you helped them plant their potatoes. It really speeds up the process. And not only does it just help things go faster, it enhances the relationships that you have with your neighbors.
These were very strong networks of mutual obligation, mutual dependence. So neighbors were strongly connected to each other by virtue of the fact that they needed each other for survival. They needed each other to do farming, they needed each other for help with fishing, and a lot of it's also built around this tradition of the minga, this tradition of labor reciprocity. And even though the economy has changed over the last 10, 20 years significantly, and you've seen this shift to more of an industrialized economy based on wage labor, and you've also seen slowly the disappearance of the minga, despite that, this memory of the minga, this tradition, really forms a centerpiece of islander identity even today.
People of Chiloé refer to themselves as Chilotes rather than Chileans. It stems from a distinct cultural difference.
Chilote people did not want to be incorporated into mainland Chile, so they fought on the side of the Spanish.
It wasn't until they were defeated by Chilean forces in the 1820s that the archipelago was forcibly incorporated into this new nation of Chile. They're very proud of that history. They're proud of the fact that they resisted incorporation into Chile. So there's a very, very strong islander identity. And a lot of that revolves around this idea of self-sufficiency, of reliance on the ocean for subsistence.
Yingwa is one of the best examples of where the Chilote identity and traditional livelihood has been able to be maintained to a large extent.
Not as strong as what you saw in rural communities in the past, but relative to other communities in Chiloé today, they've been able to actually carry on with a lot of their rural subsistence practices a lot more than other communities that have been sucked into this industrialized economy much more quickly.
There really aren't any businesses there, essentially. It's all just homes, people with their farms, working their land, lots of crops, lots of livestock, rely a lot on fishing.
The Minga has actually remained relatively strong. Neighbors still practice it. Irene, who lives in Yingwa with her family, she lives with her husband Hugo and her daughter Raquel. They're a good example of a family that still lives pretty close to the land and the ocean. A lot of what they eat is fish that they themselves catch, crops that they themselves grow. What we would refer to as very sustainable practices. They don't necessarily think of these livelihood practices in terms of sustainability. It's simply what they've been doing for generations.
So they do have some cash from sales of seaweed and food that they've grown on their farms. It's really an auxiliary thing in comparison to them subsisting off of their land and the fish that they and their neighbors have caught. They still really depend on this interlocking relationship between neighbors and the solidarity that it's formed.
The pace of life was definitely a lot slower than it is here in the United States. It was slower, but you were still working hard, and it was still very fulfilling. One day we helped Irene go collect firewood, and we actually threw firewood off of a cliff, which was pretty entertaining. And we helped her feed her cattle. We helped her pick potatoes, and there was a day where she went and bought fish from some fishermen and some centollas, which are crabs, which were giant.
While I was on my homestay, you could really see how these bonds were important to them. They have actively and intentionally been avoiding this shift into wage labor jobs.
On Yingwa, for example, they detest the salmon farms because it's essentially a symbol of their way of life being shifted and changed and taken away.
Hugo, one of the reasons that he said no to working a wage labor job on a salmon farm is because he said that he would know his neighbors, but it wouldn't be the same because he wouldn't owe them anything and they wouldn't owe him anything. And that's really something that they take pride in, is the relationships with their neighbors and the solidarity that they've built up over many generations of helping one another. Some families on Yingwa have worked wage labor jobs, like working on the salmon farm, and you can already kind of tell how these families are disconnected to an extent from the rest of the community on the island because they don't engage in these reciprocal labor exchanges.
Raquel, you could kind of tell that her generation is going away or drifting away from the old culture of Yingwa and Chiloé, where she's preparing herself to go into more of a cash-based economy, where she's going to school in order to become a chef.
Even on a place like Yingwa, where you can still see this traditional livelihood, you can already see this cash economy sort of creeping in more and more with the younger generations.
But it's hard to predict where Chiloé is headed.
But if I had to guess, I would say that Chiloé is just slowly going to start drifting towards a more cash-based economy.
Though much has changed, islanders still celebrate their culture through stories, food, architecture, and music.
Allá se encuentra Matao. Creció un hermoso clavel.
Only time will tell the future of Chiloé.
Tu sangre raza chilhueña la dedicaste a tu iglesia.